The mansion was already failing when people were still living inside it. A body had been found on the property before the gates ever rusted shut, before the parties stopped, before anyone agreed to call the place cursed. By the time authorities arrived, the damage was done. 2 lives ended inside a car that never should have been there, parked on land that was supposed to represent control, wealth, permanence. Nothing about the scene suggested accident. The gun was familiar. The silence afterward was not. What followed was not a single scandal, but a sequence of quiet withdrawal. Invitations were never sent. Music stopped echoing from the upper floors. Staff learned which rooms to avoid and which questions not to ask. The estate remained operational, immaculate from the road, yet something essential had collapsed without announcement. The cost was not measured in money. It showed up in locked doors, in habits that changed, in a property that suddenly felt too large for the people occupying it. And this was only the first visible fracture. Over the next months, the estate absorbed consequences the way stone absorbs moisture, slowly, invisibly. The public noticed nothing at first. Outsiders still spoke of excess, of grandeur, of a place immune to the rules that governed ordinary lives. But inside the gates, decisions began to pile up. Repairs were delayed. Entire wings went unused. What had once been expansion turned into containment. The mistake was not that something terrible happened. The mistake was believing it could be isolated. By the time whispers reached beyond the property line, the mansion had already started to repeat itself. Another closure, another abandoned space, another indulgence meant to distract from what could no longer be controlled. The building kept growing heavier, not structurally, but psychologically. It demanded upkeep, attention, justification. Every solution introduced a new obligation. Every indulgence required defense. The question was no longer what happened that night. The question was why everything that followed seemed to make the house worse. At some point, the mansion stopped being a symbol of achievement and became a container for unresolved decisions. Its scale amplified mistakes instead of hiding them. Excess no longer impressed. It echoed. People noticed how long lights stayed on in empty rooms, how entire sections of the grounds were maintained without purpose, how the owner moved through the property as if navigating something already lost. The error wasn't impulsive. It wasn't sudden. It was embedded. Somewhere early on, a decision had been made that assumed permanence, of wealth, of relevance, of control. That assumption shaped every choice afterward. When grief appeared, it was managed with expansion. When boredom appeared, it was answered with spectacle. When silence became uncomfortable, it was filled with noise instead of restraint. The mansion did not cause these reactions, it rewarded them. Only after the damage accumulated did the pattern become visible. The house was not too large to maintain, it was too large to correct. Every room added another surface where consequences could linger. Every feature designed to impress became another liability once admiration faded. What no one admitted aloud was that the house was functioning exactly as designed. It absorbed attention, consumed resources, and required constant escalation to justify its existence. The moment escalation stopped, decay began. And decay, unlike ambition, does not announce itself. It hides in unused spaces, in locked doors that never reopen, in rooms preserved not for use, but for memory. The mansion became an archive of past confidence, proof that certainty had once existed and that it had been misplaced. Long before the property was sold, repurposed, or abandoned, it had already crossed a threshold. It stopped being a residence and became a burden disguised as legacy. Those closest to it adjusted their lives around its demand. Leaving was complicated, staying was expensive, admitting failure was impossible. The house remained. The cost shifted. What no one could see yet was that the mansion was not finished taking payment. It had only collected the first installment. Everything that followed, every transformation, every scandal, every attempt to reinvent the space would trace back to the same miscalculation, believing that size could substitute for stability. The place would survive its owner, but not in the way it was intended. By the time the world re-entered those rooms, for a different purpose entirely, the original mistake had already hardened into architecture. Walls built to impress, would trap. Corridors meant to serve would confuse. Grandeur would become weight. And the mansion, once designed to defy limits, would prove something else instead. That some decisions don't collapse immediately. They wait. The house didn't empty all at once. It hollowed. Rooms lost their function before they lost their furniture. A dining room still set for scale, but never for people. Guest quarters cleaned weekly despite never hosting guests. Entire floors maintained out of habit, not necessity. The staff adapted quietly, learning new routes through corridors that no longer needed traffic, shortening routines without being asked. Nothing was officially closed. It simply stopped being used. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. That was the danger. The lawn was cut. The facade held. Windows stayed intact. The illusion of continuity was preserved with discipline. What disappeared was circulation, movement, purpose, reason. The mansion became static, a display rather than a place. This was when the costs began to change shape. Money still flowed, but inefficiently. Resources were spent maintaining emptiness rather than enabling life. Heat for rooms no one entered. Repairs to wings no one remembered designing. The building demanded consistency, even as relevance eroded. Every square foot required justification, and none provided return. The owner noticed, but framed it incorrectly. The problem, he believed, was atmosphere, energy, momentum. So the solution followed the same logic that had created the house in the first place. Add something, another attraction, another reason for people to arrive, another layer of spectacle to overpower the quiet that had settled into the wall. It worked, briefly. New projects introduced motion, but also complexity. More system, more staff, more dependency. Each addition assumed that the underlying structure was sound. It wasn't. The foundation wasn't cracked, but the premise was. The house had been built to absorb admiration, not stress. When admiration thinned, stress accumulated without release. What no one considered was subtraction. Closing rooms felt like admitting defeat. Scaling down felt disloyal to the original vision. The mansion wasn't designed to be flexible. It was designed to be final, a statement that did not anticipate revision. That rigidity turned every adjustment into friction. Meanwhile, attention drifted. The public moved on to newer excesses, fresher fortunes. The mansion was still talked about, but less often, and with a different tone. What once sounded like awe began to carry curiosity, then skepticism, then quiet speculation. When fascination turns analytical, decay follows quickly. Inside the house, behavior shifted. The owner spent less time in the most impressive rooms. The spaces that once justified the structure now highlighted its imbalance. Smaller rooms became preferable. Corners, offices, areas that could still feel proportionate to a single person's presence. Grandeur became uncomfortable when it no longer reflected momentum. This was not decline. It was misalignment. The house was calibrated for a life that had already ended. Every day spent inside, it was an act of maintenance, not growth. Decisions were no longer about expansion, but about preventing visible failure. That distinction mattered. Preventing collapse requires constant input. Growth, at least, produces output. At some point, the building began to dictate behavior. Paths through it shortened. Routines narrowed. Entire wings faded from memory. The owner didn't tour his own property anymore. He navigated. The house was no longer something he used. It was something he managed. And management without purpose is exhaustion. What followed were compromises that would have been unthinkable earlier. Temporary measures became permanent. Unfinished plans stayed unfinished. Areas once designed to impress were repurposed quietly, stripped of identity to solve immediate problems. Each compromise made the original vision harder to recover. Still, no one spoke of failure. Failure implies an endpoint. This had none. It was an ongoing exchange where the house demanded upkeep and offered diminishing return. The imbalance widened slowly enough to feel manageable. That was the trap. Large systems rarely collapse dramatically. They persist just long enough to normalize their own inefficiency. The mansion began to feel older than it was. Not structurally, psychologically. It carried the weight of decisions made under different assumptions. Every corridor reflected confidence that no longer existed. Every feature reminded its owner of a time when justification wasn't required. Eventually, the house stopped representing success and started representing obligation. Visitors sensed it before they could articulate it. The scale felt off. The silence lingered too long. The effort to maintain appearances was visible in the smallest details. Doors polished but never opened, spaces curated but unused. Excess without momentum reads differently. It feels defensive. The mistake had matured. The mansion was no longer an expression of ambition. It was a record of it. And records don't adapt. They only preserve. What was preserved here was a version of life that no longer aligned with reality. That mismatch would soon attract outside interest. Not admiration, but opportunity. When a place stops serving its original purpose, others begin imagining new ones. The mansion's size, once its greatest strength, made it adaptable to futures its creator never intended. The house was still standing, but it had already outlived the life it was built for. The first outsiders didn't arrive with authority. They arrived with ideas. At first, they were framed as helpers, consultants, planners, advisors offering ways to activate unused space. They walked the grounds slowly, measuring not just dimensions, but potential. Where the owner saw maintenance, they saw opportunity. Where he saw history, they saw underutilization. Their language was neutral, professional, careful not to sound like replacement, but replacement was already implied. They asked questions that had no good answer. How often were certain rooms used? What purpose did entire structures now serve? How much did it cost to keep the property functioning versus productive? None of these questions accused. They simply exposed the gap between scale and utility. The owner resisted, not emotionally but procedurally. He approved studies instead of changes, reviews instead of commitment. Time became a buffer. As long as nothing definitive happened, the house remained his. Control, even over decline, still felt like ownership. Meanwhile, the property itself continued to age in ways that attention could no longer disguise. Systems installed for luxury proved fragile under constant strain. Custom solutions required custom repairs. Nothing could be replaced with something standard. Every fix demanded expertise, time, and negotiation. The house was unique, and uniqueness is expensive once novelty wears off. This was when function began to shift. Sections of the estate were quietly repurposed, not officially, not ceremonially, just practically. A room designed for display became storage. A space meant for gathering became administrative. These changes weren't symbolic. They were survival tactics. The mansion was adapting in ways its creator never intended. And adaptation, once it starts, rarely stops at the boundary you set. The owner began spending less time on the ground. Absence created room for others to fill operational gaps. Managers gained autonomy. Decisions once filtered through personal preference became procedural. Efficiency replaced pride. The house didn't notice. It continued demanding what it always had. But who answered those demands began to change. That shift mattered more than anyone realized. At some point, the estate stopped being defended and started being evaluated. Evaluated for use, for capacity, for future relevance. The questions were no longer about preservation, but about transformation. And transformation carries its own logic, one that doesn't prioritize sentiment. What made the mansion vulnerable wasn't its condition, it was its adaptability. Large spaces invite redefinition. Long corridors don't care who walks them. Rooms don't remember their purpose. Only people do. And once the people stop insisting, the space becomes available. Proposals began circulating that reimagined the estate entirely, not as a residence, not as a monument, but as infrastructure, something scalable, something institutional. The language was careful, but the direction was clear. The house could serve more people. It could justify its footprint. It could finally match cost with output. This logic was difficult to argue against because it wasn't hostile. It was rational. The owner resisted in small ways, delays, revisions, requests for alternatives, but the leverage was gone. The mansion consumed too much to exist purely as a personal statement. That statement had already been made. Repeating it no longer convinced anyone. Eventually, the decision stopped feeling like a choice. When the transition came, it arrived framed as necessity, as responsibility. As inevitability, the estate would continue, just not as intended. The language emphasized continuity, but continuity of structure, not meaning. The house would remain. The purpose would not. This was the moment when the original mistake became irreversible. Once ownership separated from intention, the mansion entered a new phase of existence. Its scale, once a symbol of individual will, became an asset to be managed. Decisions were no longer guided by memory, but by capacity. The house's history became background information, not instruction. The transformation wasn't immediate. It unfolded in layers. Administrative changes first, then physical ones. Divisions added where openness once mattered. Barriers introduced for efficiency. Routes optimized. The house learned a new rhythm. Functional, repetitive, impersonal. And the walls accepted it. Spaces that once amplified individuality now absorbed anonymity. The mansion stopped reflecting a single life and began containing many. The silence changed. It was no longer the quiet of neglect, but the quiet of regulation. The building was busy, but in a way that erased its past rather than extending it. This is what happens when scale outlives intention. It invites substitution. The owner watched this transition with a strange detachment, part relief, part resignation. The burden was lifting, but so was authorship. The house no longer belonged to his narrative. It was being edited by others, for reasons that made sense but felt distant. What remained unspoken was that this outcome had been embedded from the beginning. A structure designed to impress the many will eventually serve the many. If not voluntarily, then by necessity. Grandeur without flexibility doesn't disappear. It gets reassigned. The mansion didn't fall. It was absorbed. And in being absorbed, it entered a chapter far darker than decline. One where its past would be overwritten, not erased. Where the walls would witness new forms of intensity, new costs, new mistakes that echoed the old one but operated at a different scale. The house had found a future, just not one its creator would recognize. The building learned routines faster than people expected. Schedules replaced spontaneity. Doors that once stayed open were assigned rules. Movement through the house followed patterns designed for oversight, not comfort. The mansion became predictable in a way it had never been before. Predictability was praised. It meant efficiency. It meant fewer surprises. It meant control had returned, just not to the person who built it. What changed most was scale of consequence. When the house belonged to one life, mistakes were personal. They bruised reputation, strained finances, damaged relationships. Now, mistakes were procedural. They affected dozens, then hundreds. A single flawed decision echoed through corridors that had never been designed for that kind of repetition. The mansion absorbed it anyway. Walls were reinforced, sightlines altered, spaces subdivided. The architecture didn't resist, it accommodated. Grandeur proved surprisingly adaptable once its symbolism was stripped away. High ceilings became acoustical problems to solve. Wide rooms became areas to regulate. The very features that once impressed now required management. People arrived who would never have been invited before. Not guests, occupants. They didn't come to admire the space. They came because it had been assigned to them. They learned the building quickly, but not affectionately. To them, it was not excessive. It was confusing. Large rooms with unclear purpose. Corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. Corners that felt forgotten. They sensed what the house had been without being told. The mansion began collecting a different kind of residue. Not celebration, not ambition. Stress, repetition, unresolved emotion. The building filled with lives that were already fragmented when they arrived. That fragmentation interacted with the space in unpredictable ways. Rooms designed to elevate now magnified instability. Silence behaved differently when it wasn't chosen. Staff adapted again. This time, adaptation meant emotional distance. You don't personalize a place that demands constant vigilance. You learn to move through it efficiently. You avoid unnecessary attachment. The house stopped being something to appreciate and became something to survive shifts inside of. What no one anticipated was how memory would behave in this environment. The mansion had been designed to display identity outward. Now it functioned as containment. That inversion mattered. Spaces built for expression now suppressed it. Features meant to inspire now disoriented. The house didn't just witness lives, it shaped their experience of time. Days blurred, rooms repeated, direction lost meaning. The cost wasn't visible from outside. The exterior still held, but inside, tension accumulated quietly. The building carried more human weight than it was ever meant to hold. Not physically, emotionally. The scale that once absorbed admiration now absorbed distress. And it did so without release. People began attributing meaning to the house itself, not metaphorically, literally. They spoke about it as if it had preferences, as if certain areas resisted use, as if the building remembered. These weren't superstitions at first. They were coping mechanisms, ways to explain why some spaces felt heavier than others, why certain corridors unsettled even seasoned staff. Management dismissed this language publicly, but privately adjusted protocols. Routes were changed, rooms avoided, not because of evidence, but because compliance was easier than confrontation. The building's internal logic was being rewritten by consensus rather than design. This is how environments acquire reputation, not through single events, but through accumulation, through enough people independently reaching the same conclusion without comparing notes. The mansion didn't need a story. It generated atmosphere. And atmosphere, once acknowledged, becomes self-reinforcing. The original owner was no longer present to object. Even if he had been, his authority would have felt irrelevant. The house no longer reflected a personal vision. It had absorbed too many lives, too many routines, too many adjustments. It was no longer his mistake alone. It was now a shared one. What made this phase particularly irreversible was legitimacy. The mansion's new function came with justification. It served a purpose. That purpose excused alteration. It rationalized erasure. History became an inconvenience rather than a guide. Preservation gave way to compliance. Yet traces remained. Details no one bothered to remove. Proportions that made no sense for the new use. Decorative remnants that quietly contradicted function. These inconsistencies created friction. They reminded occupants, subtly, constantly, that the building was never meant for this. The mansion became a place where intention and reality never fully aligned. That gap produced discomfort no policy could eliminate. People blamed the structure because blaming decisions felt pointless. The decisions had already hardened, and so the house continued, operating successfully by external metrics while failing internally in ways that were harder to measure. It contained, regulated, processed, but it did not resolve. Whatever entered it rarely left unchanged. The irony was complete. A mansion built to prove permanence had become a place defined by transience. People passed through it, marked by the experience. The building remained, accumulating stories without context, emotion without narrative. It no longer told a story of ambition. It told one of endurance. And endurance, when prolonged without meaning, begins to resemble something darker. Not collapse, not decay, something quieter. The house had learned to wait. The building did not become infamous overnight. It became known through repetition. The same complaints surfaced independently, voiced by people who had never spoken to one another. Certain rooms felt colder, no matter the season. Some corridors distorted sound, making footsteps seem closer than they were. Directions that made sense on paper failed in practice. People got lost inside a structure that had not changed its layout. The building wasn't shifting. Perception was. Administrators attributed this to stress, fatigue, human error. Those explanations were correct, but incomplete. Stress doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It responds to environments that amplify it. The mansion did exactly that. Its scale exaggerated small disruptions into persistent unease. Minor confusion became chronic disorientation. Silence became pressure rather than calm. What the house did best was remove reference points. In places designed for grandeur, proportion matters. When proportion is misapplied, it unsettles. The building's original design assumed confidence, wealth, and choice. Now it housed people with none of those. The mismatch produced tension no amount of routine could smooth out. Spaces meant to elevate instead diminish. They made individuals feel smaller than necessary. Over time, the mansion developed unofficial rules. Certain staircases were avoided. Specific rooms reassigned repeatedly because no one wanted them. Shifts were traded quietly, not out of fear, out of preference. Preference hardened into habit, habit into doctrine. Before long, the building had an internal map that contradicted its blueprints. The house had developed a second architecture. This architecture wasn't physical, it was behavioral. Roots shaped by avoidance, spaces defined by emotional residue. The mansion functioned on paper as designed. In reality, it operated on an entirely different logic, one shaped by cumulative discomfort. When maintenance issues arose, they took longer to resolve, not because of neglect, but because the building resisted simplification. Every fix revealed another complication. Systems overlapped in ways that assumed coordination rather than compartmentalization. The house had been built as a singular organism. That made isolation difficult. Everything connected to something else. The original ambition had been coherent. The result was dependency. When parts of the building were decommissioned, the impact spread unexpectedly. Temperature changed elsewhere. Sound traveled differently. Light patterns shifted. The house responded as a whole, not in sections. This made incremental change risky. Any adjustment carried unintended consequences, and unintended consequences breed hesitation. Management learned to tolerate inefficiency rather than provoke instability. Spaces stayed unused because reassigning them created problems elsewhere. Repairs were delayed because intervention often caused more disruption than the original issue. The building's complexity protected its dysfunction. The longer this continued, the more the mansion felt autonomous. People spoke about it carefully, as if language itself might provoke resistance. The building had moods, good days and bad ones. These descriptions weren't mystical. They were practical shorthand for a system that behaved unpredictably. But shorthand, repeated often enough, becomes belief. Belief changes behavior. As belief spread, the mansion's reputation thickened. New arrivals sensed it immediately, not through stories, through atmosphere. The house didn't feel neutral. It felt occupied even when empty, not haunted, claimed, as if previous purposes still pressed against the present. What pressed hardest was scale. Large spaces amplify isolation. Long corridors stretch time. High ceilings detach sound from source. These features, once admired, now distorted experience. People felt observed without being watched, heard without being addressed. The building dislocated cause from effect. None of this was intentional. That made it worse. Intent implies control. The absence of intent creates uncertainty. The mansion was no longer governed by vision or even policy. It was governed by momentum. And momentum favors whatever has already accumulated. The house had accumulated stress. At some point, officials considered relocation, not because the building failed structurally, but because it refused to simplify. Newer facilities offered clarity, straight lines, defined purpose, spaces that did not argue with use. The mansion, by comparison, felt stubborn, but abandonment was complicated. The scale that once justified its creation now justified its preservation. It was too large to discard easily, too expensive to replace, too entrenched to resolve cleanly. The building existed in an administrative limbo, functional enough to keep, problematic enough to regret. When closure finally came, it arrived quietly, not as a reaction to catastrophe, but as an accumulation of inefficiencies that no longer balanced. The house didn't fail. It was outpaced. New standards emerged that it couldn't meet without losing itself entirely. As occupants departed, something unexpected happened. The building didn't feel relieved. It felt unfinished. Rooms emptied, but presence lingered. Not people, pattern. The house had adapted to occupation and now struggled with absence. Systems designed for constant use decayed faster without it. Silence settled differently this time. It wasn't tense, it was unresolved. The mansion entered its most unstable phase. Vacancy without erasure. No routines, no justification, no new identity. Just a structure full of echoes waiting to be interpreted. Without function, the building became a canvas. And canvases invite projection. This is when stories begin to form, not because something new happens, but because nothing corrects what's imagined. The mansion stripped of oversight, became vulnerable to narrative. Every sound gained meaning. Every shadow suggested intent. Without daily use to normalize its presence, the house became other. The mistake had evolved again. What began as overconfidence had become overexposure. A building too large, too complex, too charged with history to disappear quietly. It had absorbed too much to return to neutrality. And now, abandoned but intact, it waited for the next interpretation. The stories filled the silence faster than people ever had. Once the building was empty, it no longer corrected interpretation. There were no routines to anchor perception, no schedules to interrupt imagination. The mansion became legible only through fragments: broken windows, peeling paint, rooms frozen mid-purpose. Each fragment invited explanation. Each explanation drifted further from fact. Trespassers arrived first, not in crowds, but individually, drawn by scale, by rumor, by the kind of curiosity that thrives where access is restricted. They moved carefully, not out of respect, but because the building demanded. Floors creaked unpredictably. Stairwells swallowed sound. Doors opened into rooms that felt too large for their contents. What they experienced wasn't fear, it was disorientation. Without function, the mansion's proportions no longer made sense. Rooms designed for gathering felt oppressive when entered alone. Corridors extended beyond expectation, bending perception of distance. Light behaved strangely in spaces built for chandeliers rather than daylight. The house felt active without doing anything. Each visitor left with a story. None were identical. Some spoke of movement where none could be confirmed. Others described sounds that followed, but never resolved. Many reported the same sensation, that the building was not empty, but waiting. These accounts circulated online, then in person, then in print. Repetition smoothed inconsistency. What mattered wasn't accuracy, but overlap. Overlap creates belief. The mansion became a container for projection. Its past, fragmented, excessive, institutional, offered raw material. People stitched together timelines that felt true even when they weren't precise. A building that had held ambition, distress, and abandonment could plausibly hold anything. The absence of a single narrative allowed multiple ones to coexist. Authorities attempted to intervene. Barriers were installed. Warnings issued. Access restricted. None of it addressed the underlying issue. The building had become interesting again, not for what it was, but for what it could represent. Restriction only sharpened that interest. The house did not resist intrusion. It absorbed it. Each unauthorized visit added another layer of meaning. Graffiti appeared, not chaotic, but declarative. Phrases suggesting memory, accusation, endurance. Whether sincere or performative didn't matter. The walls accepted all of it. The mansion became collaborative, a place where strangers contributed to an evolving mythology. What made this phase dangerous wasn't superstition. It was simplification. Complex histories were flattened into symbols. Nuance gave way to mood. The building became shorthand for excess, decay, warning. These interpretations ignored specifics, but captured atmosphere. And atmosphere travels faster than detail. Soon, the mansion was no longer discussed as architecture. It was discussed as experience. People who had never been inside spoke confidently about how it felt. They described rooms they had only seen in photographs. Emotion replaced evidence. This is how places lose control of their own story. Attempts to reframe the narrative came too late. Official explanations sounded defensive. Restoration proposals felt suspicious. Why preserve something that had become useful as a ruin? The decay itself had value now. It authenticated the stories. Repair threatened that authenticity. The building's greatest vulnerability had always been scale. Now it was scale that protected it. The mansion could be many things at once because it was large enough to support contradiction. One wing suggested neglect. Another hinted at preservation. The whole resisted resolution. Eventually, interest shifted again. This time, it came with resources. Developers, institutions, planners, people who saw potential rather than mystery. They studied the structure not as myth, but as asset. Square footage, location, adaptability. To them, the stories were obstacles, not feature, problems to be managed through design and messaging. Plans emerged that promised rebirth, renewal, a future that would honor the past without being bound by it. The language was familiar. It had been used before. What mattered was that this time, it wasn't coming from within. The mansion stood at another threshold. Erase too much, and you lose what makes it compelling. Preserve too much, and you inherit unresolved weight. The building had accumulated meaning beyond intention. Any attempt to redefine it risked activating resistance, not from people who loved it, but from people who needed it to remain unresolved. Restoration began cautiously, section by section. Stabilization rather than transformation. Workers reported the same thing visitors had. The building felt difficult, not structurally, psychologically. Decisions took longer. Plans changed unexpectedly, not because of hidden damage, but because the building refused to simplify. It was as if every attempt to impose clarity exposed another layer of contradiction. This wasn't sabotage, it was inheritance. The mansion had lived too many lives to become singular again. Each phase had left residue: ambition, control, distress, abandonment, projection. You could remove walls, but not implication. You could repaint surfaces, but not erase association. What emerged during restoration was an uncomfortable truth. The building didn't want redemption. It didn't need it. Redemption implies guilt. The mansion wasn't guilty. It had simply done what large, unexamined decisions always do: persist long enough to outlast their creators. The mistake had never been corrected. It had been redistributed. As work continued, the house revealed just enough to remain unstable, enough history to resist clean narrative, enough presence to remain charged, enough ambiguity to keep people arguing about what it was and what it should be. And in that unresolved state, the mansion found equilibrium, not as a home, not as an institution, not as a ruin, but as something harder to define, something that survived every attempt to fix it. The building did not return to what it was. It stabilized into what it had become. Restoration never finished the job people expected it to. Walls were reinforced, systems modernized, surfaces cleaned. Yet no amount of intervention restored coherence. The mansion remained legible only in fragments. Each renovated space carried the weight of what it replaced. Each preserved detail contradicted what surrounded it. The result was not harmony, but coexistence. Visitors noticed immediately. They described the place as impressive, unsettling, impressive again. The reactions contradicted themselves, often within the same sentence. People couldn't agree on what the building communicated, only that it communicated something. That ambiguity became its defining feature. The mansion no longer needed a single story. It functioned as a surface onto which meaning was projected. That was its final form. Attempts to frame the building as a lesson failed. Lessons require clarity. The mansion offered none. It didn't warn explicitly against ambition, excess, or neglect. It simply demonstrated what happens when decisions outlive their context. The structure stood not as a moral, but as evidence of scale without exit. The original mistake, believing permanence could be built, had completed its cycle, not through collapse, but through persistence. The mansion still stood because tearing it down would require consensus, and consensus was impossible. Too many interpretations depended on its continued existence. It had become untouchable. What remained visible was not the error itself, but its residue. The way spaces resisted simplification. The way every new use carried echoes of the previous one. The way no single narrative could dominate without feeling incomplete. The building existed in tension with itself. People mistook that tension for mystery. In reality, it was accumulation. Too many purposes layered without resolution. Too many moments frozen rather than concluded. The house had never been allowed to end one chapter before starting another. Each transition had been additive. Nothing was fully discarded. Everything lingered. This is why the mansion felt heavy, not haunted, not cursed, weighted by unresolved intent. The structure had become a ledger of decisions made under certainty and maintained under denial. Each generation interacting with it believed they were the first to truly understand it. None were. Understanding wasn't the problem. Integration was. There was no way to integrate all the lives the building had contained without contradiction. And contradiction does not disappear. It persists. Over time, the mansion settled into a strange equilibrium. It was maintained but not domesticated, respected but not trusted, valued but not loved. It appeared in photographs, documentaries, conversations, always slightly out of reach, always resisting summary. That resistance was the point. The building no longer needed its creator. His intentions had been absorbed, distorted, redistributed. His presence existed only as a pressure beneath the surface. The house had outgrown authorship. It belonged to sequence now, not origin. When people asked what the mansion was really about, the answers varied. Wealth, decline, institutional failure, cultural neglect, architectural excess. None were wrong. None were sufficient. The truth was simpler and less satisfying. The mansion was about continuity without correction, a decision made at scale, protected by resources, and left unexamined long enough to harden into environment. Once hardened, it dictated behavior long after the decision-maker was gone. The building didn't impose itself through force. It did so through inertia. Inertia is harder to fight than opposition. Today, the mansion exists as a solved problem that never resolved. Its systems function. Its walls stand. Its purpose remains flexible but never neutral. It absorbs new uses while preserving the discomfort of its past. It reminds without instructing. It endures without adapting completely. The error remains embedded, not as failure, but as structure. The house will likely outlast current plan, current caretakers, current interpretations. That is what it was built to do, not intentionally, but inevitably. Large decisions have long half-lives. They don't disappear when context changes. They wait for the next set of assumptions to collide with, and when that happens, the cycle repeats. Someone will arrive convinced they can finally define the building. Someone will believe they can clarify its purpose, simplify its meaning, stabilize its future. They will underestimate how much has already been layered into the walls. The mansion will accept their effort. It always does. And when they leave, something of their intention will remain, misaligned, unresolved, preserved alongside everything else. Another layer added to a structure that has never learned how to subtract. That is the dark story the house tells, without words. Not that ambition destroys, not that excess invites ruin, but that permanence, once assumed, becomes obligation. And obligation, when scaled too large, outlives everyone who believed they were in control of it. The mansion is still standing, not because it succeeded, but because it never stopped.